Before we begin today's episode, a quick announcement. We often receive requests from listeners to interview certain guests, and one name that has come up repeatedly is historian Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University, famous for his online lectures on Ukrainian history and his ongoing commentary on the war. Well, I'm delighted to say that Joe, David and I have now recorded a full-length interview with Professor Snyder, facilitated by the charity United 24, who, with his support, are fundraising for a new air defence system via their project Safe Skies. That interview will be released as a special bonus episode this weekend, featuring extended discussions on why he's optimistic about Ukraine's future, misunderstandings about Russia, and his meetings with President Zelensky. It's a genuinely fascinating interview, so be sure you don't miss it. Thank you. I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, following the latest military and political updates, I interview a former British frigate captain on what it's like tailing Russian submarines. And we look in closer detail on the work being done to raise awareness of Russian war crimes.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 1st of December, 1 year and 280 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I sit down with retired Navy Commander Sharpe to discuss his experiences, as well as the evolving maritime picture in the conflict and what it implies for the future of naval warfare. Plus, David talks to the co-founders of the Ukrainian NGO PR Army, which works closely with journalists worldwide to connect them with Ukrainian eyewitnesses to war crimes. I began, however, by summarising the latest developments on the battlefield and beyond. The lead development is that Russian forces launched more than 24 Iranian-designed attack drones and 2 missiles on the south and east of the country, according to Ukrainian sources. As we've reported on the podcast for some months now, Russian forces are believed to have been stockpiling drones and missiles for systematic attacks on Ukraine's energy grid over the winter months. Whilst much work has been done in this area, and there is room for optimism compared to, say, last year, Kyiv has conceded that it needs more defensive weapons from the West to protect more vulnerable regions. As such, President Zelensky has said the war has entered a new phase as it enters winter. To quote him, "Look, we are not backing down. We are fighting with the second best army in the world. We wanted faster results. From that perspective, unfortunately, we did not achieve the desired results. And this is a fact. There is not enough power. But this does not mean that we should give up, that we have to surrender." Now, on these drone and missile strikes specifically, a Ukrainian Air Force spokesperson stated that Ukrainian forces destroyed the first wave of Shahed drones over Odessa Oblast, but that Russian forces had launched drones in several directions towards northern and western Ukraine. And that might explain why there was some success. The Russians are trying to find ways to outfox the air defences, it seems. But the Ukrainians are not just on the defensive. As reported by the ISW, the Ukrainian Security Service was reportedly involved in an explosion that caused disruptions on a section of the East Siberian Railway connecting Russia and China on the night of the 29th. Russian railways stated that a freight train caught fire in a tunnel section in far eastern Russia. 2 railway cars carrying diesel fuel detonated, according to them, igniting 6 total railway cars. Ukrainian intelligence sources stated that 4 explosive devices detonated on the railway as part of an SBU operation, and that the railway line, which is the only major line between Russia and China and is used to transport military supplies, is, to quote them, paralysed. Russian opposition outlet Astra stated that Russia uses that railway to transport weapons from North Korea. So this should be seen, I think, as an attempt by Kyiv to disrupt the transportation of those stockpiles from Pyongyang that we've talked so much about ever since we were in the US. Now, in other spheres beyond the military, Russia is working on the assumption that sanctions against it by the United States and its allies will last for many years. But the US influence on the world economy is waning. That's according to Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Peskov made these comments in response to an interview in the US by Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources Jeffrey Pyatt. That Washington was aiming to halve Russia's oil and gas revenues by the end of the decade. Now, on this theme, The Economist has published a very interesting piece examining the state of the Russian economy, that perennial question, of course, which we've been discussing on the podcast ever since the full-scale invasion. It's called How Putin is Reshaping Russia to Keep His War Machine Running. And it goes into much more detail on the fact that the richer and more educated people are, seemingly the more supportive they are of the war. As I remember we speculated was likely to occur, there is now a bigger class of bureaucrats and businessmen who've attained their status through patronage and who will uphold the regime in order to protect it. And this piece quotes a survey of some Russian entrepreneurs. Now, interestingly, these individuals, it says, having worked through several financial crises and battled with predatory bureaucrats, put a premium on preparing for the worst. To quote the article, the disappearance of Western imports and the closure of Western firms has opened new niches for Russian companies. At the same time, the capital controls imposed by the central bank have left them with few options but to invest in Russia. The government has offered loans and even ordered bureaucrats not to harass said entrepreneurs. Yet, with the Russian government's budget ballooning, something we've discussed many times, defence spending alone is set to almost double next year to 6% of GDP, the highest it's been since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Spending on health and education is falling in real terms. As the Kremlin's finance minister recently declared, the main emphasis is on ensuring victory. The army, defensive capability, armed forces, fighters, everything needed for the front, he said, everything needed for victory is in the budget. Now, to quote The Economist, such lavish outlays will not be sustainable indefinitely. The central bank is struggling to restrain rising inflation, which reached 12% year on year in the third quarter of this year. It's raised interest rates to 15%. The authorities, meanwhile, are forcing exporters to convert their revenues to rubles to stave off further devaluation, which would exacerbate inflation. Some 43% of Russians expect their economic situation to worsen in the next year or two, while only 21% expect it to improve. But, as the piece examines, for the moment, there is seemingly a bonanza, especially in certain parts of the economy and certain segments of Russian society. Construction, consumption and services are growing in regions close to the war zone or with lots of munitions factories. In the Far East, there is heavy investment in infrastructure to expand trade with Asia, since ties to Europe have withered. Moscow and St. Petersburg, interestingly, do not benefit much from this new order, but depressed industrial regions, Putin's heartland in essence, are living better than they have for years. Russia's vast and poor hinterland has also benefited from the cash the authorities are dangling in order to secure more recruits to the army. Yet there is, of course, a contradiction at the heart of this. Putin wants both to mobilise ever more manpower and money for the fight, and yet at the same time to secure Russians' acquiescence by disrupting their lives as little as possible. As economic dislocation increases and resources get more scarce, those conflicts will only grow. Recent Russian opposition polls indicate that the numbers of Russians who fully support the war in Ukraine has almost halved, as I say, since February 2023, and that more Russians support a withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine than do not. Relatives of mobilised personnel, too, are continuing to make widespread complaints and appeals for aid for mobilised personnel, despite reported Russian efforts to censor those complaints. The Kremlin is working overtime to ensure that Putin's electoral support does not rest on those battlefield successes. Instead, they've made this conflict against the West so that any success, however small, can be seen as a triumph when measured by that margin. Now, one final word on economic matters. I also wanted to recommend a piece by the historian Adam Tooze, a name whose works will be familiar to regular listeners. I've cited them several times on the podcast, not least his book, Wages of Destruction. He's written a piece on his Substack titled The Precarious Stabilisation of Ukraine's War Economy. Now, I haven't the time to summarise it all here. I'm very keen to get to our guest, but it's a very detailed look at the Ukrainian wartime economy and how it is being kept afloat. He concludes the piece by saying, the precarious stabilisation depends on two things. Ukraine manages to continue the war as a grinding attritional struggle, and the flow of external finance continues. As Sharpe said, it is in budgets like this you can hear the thunder of world history. The key questions going forward are, will this patchwork be enough to sustain Ukraine in its vastly unequal struggle with Russia? And secondly, where in this balance does the United States figure? Will the Biden administration secure congressional approval for more aid for Ukraine? And what are the prospects beyond 2024? So we'll make sure the links to both the piece in The Economist and that piece on Substack are in the description for the episode. Some of those core questions that we've touched on the podcast many times now about the state of the Russian economy, the long-term economic prospects for Ukraine, if some of that Western support withers, are explored in much more detail in those pieces. And I know for some listeners they're probably a little bit dry compared to some of the military aspects of this, but of course they are absolutely vital for the military picture. But let's turn to that now. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast by retired Navy Commander Tom Sharpe, who spent 20 years at sea, sailed in all the oceans and captained 4 ships, including HMS St Albans, an anti-submarine frigate in the Gulf and in the High North, hunting Russian submarines. Now, our main intention today, Tom, is to do a deeper dive, if you'll excuse the pun, into the current naval picture in this war. But before we get into that, I have to ask, can you just lay out for us what exactly is involved in hunting Russian subs? It sounds rather daring do and dashing, but what are you looking out for? What does it involve on a day-to-day basis?
Hi, Francis, and thanks for having me on. Yes, it's actually not that dashing, and it's not that daring do. It's a bit like postal chess. It's played out over weeks, if not months. So we used to liken ourselves to the RAF fast response aircraft that kind of sonic boom over the north of Scotland to intercept bombers. Only they're back by tea time. We're normally back sometime the following month. So I was in command of HMS St Albans, which at the time was our newest towed array frigate, which is to say an anti-submarine specialist ship with a sonar specifically configured for detecting submarines in deep water. And we were on call for my entire time, normally sitting in Portsmouth. But if it started to get a bit more interesting and movements were detected, out of area deployers, as we used to call them, were detected, then we would sometimes pre-position up in Faslane on the west coast of Scotland there, just to lessen the distance. And then really you're plugging into the entire network of anti-submarine capabilities. This is never a one-on-one. This is never ship versus submarine. It's never submarine versus submarine. There's a spider's web of capabilities and equipments that all integrate. Now, that's fascinating in its own right, because you've got air forces, you've got intelligence agencies, you've got satellite coverage, you've got all sorts of bits and pieces operating across many countries at a very highly classified level. So integrating into that network is quite challenging in its own right. But if it works well. And then you know these things are coming, and then you're dispatched from whichever port you've ended up in to go and intercept them with really sort of two things in mind. The first thing is to deter. As always with navies, we spend a vast amount of our time doing just that. In fact, it's the core role to stop things escalating further. So there's a deterrence part, and then there's the bit where you actually want to keep them away from certain things. The two most obvious of which are our own submarines. We need to keep the Russian submarines away from those for reasons I can go into if you'd like. And the other one is to keep them away from our critical underwater infrastructure, the pipes, the cables, the telecommunications, the energy supply cables, all of which are vulnerable and have been shown to be more vulnerable in the last few months. So our job was really to get up there, get up north, sometimes a long way north, certainly through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, and form part of this web of detecting and deterring these out-of-area deployers from Russia.
Well, that's fascinating, and we'll get into more of your personal experiences later on, absolutely. But let's zoom out then, and it's been a while, I think, on the podcast that we've really reflected on the overall naval picture in the context of Ukraine and Russia. So if I were to ask you, Tom, and you write very regularly for the Telegraph, I should say, and listeners should definitely check out your fascinating and detailed pieces on some of these questions. In your view, what are the relative strengths and weaknesses of the Russian and Ukrainian naval position at the moment? What is the status quo almost 2 years into the conflict?
You do have to step back slightly, otherwise I'll end up comparing hull numbers to hull numbers, and that's never the way to start these conversations. But it's amazing how often they end up that way. And I think if you look to some of the points you made about economies, freedom of navigation, movement of grain and other products out of the Black Sea, and you start there as your sort of point of reference, then it gives a clear indication of what the status quo is right now, irrespective of which ships have been hit and destroyed and what tactics have been used, and I'll come on to that. But right now, the status quo, and I say this almost sort of, hesitantly, perhaps because as a mariner, I'm naturally superstitious. But right now, it's quite positive in terms of exporting products from Ukraine through the Black Sea, through that humanitarian corridor, and out into the wide blue yonder, and to places that really, really need that stuff. Then it's relatively positive. We've had 100 ships have now gone through that humanitarian corridor since it was formed. Overall exports they're down. They're still down. Let's not sort of make it too positive, but they're down by about 30% on what they would normally be at this time of year. So all this toing and froing and striking of Russian ships and counter striking by Russian ships on grain silos is ongoing and very, very kinetic and one to track. But the end result of this, if Russia's aim is to disrupt the flow of produce out of the Black Sea, then they're failing. If Ukraine's aim is to ensure the freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, then they're succeeding, albeit with large caveats applied. And there's many more twists and turns to this to come, I'm sure.
That's very interesting. And obviously we've seen the news this week and actually really for several weeks now about the very precarious situation of the Black Sea fleet, Russia's Black Sea fleet. I just wonder if you can reflect on that as somebody who actually, in a sense, has had to dock frigates, boats for all of your career. How disastrous is it if you lose your main base? If that becomes a potential target / it becomes no longer usable, whether for weather or just infrastructural limitations. Just in a sort of practical sense, give us a sense of how serious that actually is.
Yes, I wrote about Sevastopol and the battering it was taking in the autumn. I mean, they've lost or had damaged 17 ships. That is a significant percentage of the Black Sea fleet, some of which are at the bottom of the Black Sea, some of which are in a bad state of repair and unlikely to be repaired in the near future. So it's a huge percentage loss rate, and the Ukrainians have been extraordinarily innovative and successful in their abilities to attack pretty much all elements actually of the Black Sea fleet. I mean, it started with the Moskva. In fact, the whole thing started with Moskva off Snake Island, and that sort of tremendous resilience shown by the Ukrainians. And then that was sent totemically to the bottom. And since then, the attacks have continued in many different forms and have been successful in a great deal of them. The Sevastopol one was really, really totemic because it was such a coordinated effort from special forces taking out their long range air surveillance radars to the Storm Shadow that we sold the Ukrainians, then striking the dry docks there. So you're not just hitting the ships, you're hitting the ability to then repair those ships. And one of the submarines that was struck was one of their more newest and more potent ones with caliber cruise missiles, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. So it took out a couple of their ships, and it took out the dry docks, and that's fundamental. The ability to continue this fight, they have to be able to build and repair these things. So, but it was also bigger than that, right? They then drove the seniors back into a reserve headquarters, and a day later that got struck, killing 33 people. And I wrote rather flippantly, I suppose, no one's volunteering for duties at Sevastopol Naval Base just now. And that's true. And it drove them back and it forced them not quite to abandon it, but not far off it. I think they left about 3 or 4 ships alongside. Again, no one's probably queuing up to be duty on those. And the ships had to withdraw, and they had to draw to somewhere further away. And now even that's under threat. So they're looking at building an entirely new base in Georgia. So the morale of the fighting force of the Black Sea, not only are they taking these damages, they've been drawn out of somewhere as important and symbolic as Sevastopol. And then their morale must be pretty fraught, I would have thought. I mean, it's not always the highest anyway in the Russian Navy, due to various reasons. They don't, of pay and etc. Pay and conditions are poor. If you're getting whacked every time you go to work, and now you're having to retreat, that's huge. And I think that came at a very important time overall in this conflict.
That's really interesting. Now, you spoke when we started about the way in which, when you were operating frigates, it's very much coordinated with other military forces. And of course, I imagine the RAF were very much part of that. One key weapon in naval warfare that we've seen is, of course, maritime patrol aircraft. And I seem to remember British military intelligence reported that Russia's Black Sea fleet had been reduced to using very old flying boats in this role, which suggests that the surveillance planes are rather hard-pressed or indeed unable to assist that fleet. Do you think that's the case? And if so, just quite how serious is that if you lose, in a sense, those eyes in the sky?
Yes, if you lose your intelligence feed, you can't win. I mean, it's really that simple. If you're sort of dialing the clock back 200 years where everything was line of sight, if you do that now, you will not succeed. So if you can suppress the enemy's ability to gather intelligence, then you will win. Now, there are plenty of ways of gathering it. So the Black Sea is not that big, remember, it's 370 miles across. So through satellite methods, etc., there are definitely other ways of hoovering in what we would call a recognized air picture. But the accuracy of that picture is absolutely vital. If you want to strategically move your scarce resources around to best effect in order to strike or defend or deter, then that recognized air picture has to be very, very accurate, particularly if you want to strike. If it's not accurate, even if it's 10 minutes out of date, then your targeting data is wrong and those weapons will miss. So you're using resources, and I'll keep coming back to resources. You're using resources to develop that recognized air picture. The day you're putting up a flying boat with binoculars is a bad day, because it means you're strapped for resources. You're now at the bottom of the barrel making stuff up in an attempt to at least try and gather some information. So yeah, that's really important. And our own maritime patrol situation is strong. Our MPAs have been there up and down the coast there for a while. The new capability we have is outstanding. The RAF's patrol aircraft is very, very good. When I described my story earlier about hunting Russian submarines in the north, that was during the gap where we had incredibly foolishly decommissioned the Nimrod, and we had a capability gap. And this fundamental part of UK defence, we just gapped for about, I think it was about 10 years. So every time I sailed, I had to ring someone in another NATO country and sort of start negotiating about whether we could use their aircraft. I mean, it's just appalling. Anyway, we rectified that now. As ever, we don't have enough of them, but when they're up and operating, they're incredibly capable and a fundamental part of this picture building and intelligence gathering, without which you cannot win.
Well, on that theme, Tom, something we've reflected on the podcast in the past is this question of the future of NATO defence. And indeed, of course, there are different forces in each country, and some countries have particular specialties, and some have larger armies, some have larger maritime capabilities. And of course, Britain famously has one of the best, certainly, fleets in Europe, if not the best, indeed in the world. So what do you think the prime sort of arrangement should be in the long term as we think about the threats posed by Russia and other hostile actors? Is it for, in essence, us to sign some kind of cooperative agreement where you say, OK, Poland builds a larger land army, Britain builds a larger maritime force? I'm not talking about a NATO army here or an EU army, but I'm talking about what is the optimal solution for this problem of not every country wanting to invest in having a full navy, a full air force, and a full armed forces? Because clearly, for whatever reasons, whether it be financial, political reality, that is not likely. We have not seen that mass mobilisation. So I'm very interested in your perspective on this fundamental question: is what is politically possible that would be optimal in your view about the future defence apparatus of Europe?
This comes to almost the key pillars of the integrated review, which was the strategy document that was set to answer this. And it didn't quite, because what we're really talking here is about, is the UK a land power or is it a sea power? And therefore, what do we need? Therefore, what should we focus on, both unilaterally, but also as part of the wider NATO alliance, as you say? And you're right, we can't do it all. Much as it's fun to play fantasy fleets, and much as people sort of gnash their teeth that we don't have a US nuclear carrier strike capability, that is unrealistic. We're hovering around the 2% of GDP. We have done since forever, and it's only ever really been in decline since the 50s. America's at 3.6% of a much larger GDP. So we need to just slide that sort of aspiration to one side. And as you say, we have to be very realistic about how we contribute to the wider alliance. And to do that, yes, we need to be very clear in our own mind what our priorities are. Is it the North Atlantic and the maritime front there? Is it NATO in Europe? Or is it global power projection, including events in the Indo-Pacific? And that is a debate that rumbles on. I mean, I would inevitably defer to the maritime in the North Atlantic and around Europe as what I think as a country should be our priority. It's a cliche, but cliches are there for a reason. 95% of our trade arrives by sea. Those undersea cables that connect us to America, trillions of dollars a day pass through those. If they get cut, if they get destroyed, we're talking about an absolute sort of, it's nuclear without using nuclear weapons. So my view, and I would say this as a mariner, I'll concede that, is that we as a country should really be focusing our build on what's required to defend the waters around the UK and up into the North Atlantic and contribute to NATO as best as we can to form part of that framework. And if that means our great, the Great British Army takes a wee bit of a hit, then that I think that's what's happening. Let's be honest, that's what's happening now anyway. Fundamentally, all of this comes down to the fact we're not resourcing defence properly across the board. Let's start there. But if that remains the base assumption, then we have to choose. And I think personally we should focus here. But it's not a zero-sum game. You can do both, and I think you can still deploy to the Indo-Pacific. You can still deploy to the Gulf. And in fact, of course, right now we have to because of what's going on there. These things are all connected. You can't just turn inwards and say, well, that we've got to keep it's extraordinary how many comments to my articles are met by why isn't the Navy in the Channel? Which is to totally sort of misunderstand what the Royal Navy is really for. But it does indicate the large percentage of people who really look at the 12-mile strip around the UK and say that's what the Navy should be doing. So the answer is somewhere between the 12 miles around the UK and the Indo-Pacific. And I think right now, we've got a good balance of forces to do that. And our build program, the Royal Navy's build program, I think suits that aspiration quite well. But as ever, there's just not quite enough of them.
When we think about Western vulnerabilities, you said there just how exposed cables are for attack. I mean, This is very much a layman's question, Tom, for which I apologise, but I imagine many listeners will be thinking along the same lines, which is how on earth can you protect these cables when they are so long? I mean, presumably they can be fairly easily targeted. You can't surely protect them all of the time. If a hostile power wants to destroy them, they can do so. So what how are we basically critically exposed here? And if, God forbid, we were to enter some sort of World War III scenario, just how doomed are we, as it were? Or perhaps I'm totally wrong here, and I hope I am, of course.
No, you're not totally wrong, but it's cat and mouse, and I think it helps if you put yourself in the mind of the enemy. So they want to disrupt our telecommunications and our power distribution network. They will have on the table in front of them, metaphorical or otherwise, what we have to deter and defeat that should they do it, and they have to work very carefully around that. So they will know that their nuclear submarines operating in the North Atlantic have been unable to do so with impunity since forever, frankly. They're getting better. And I would say, just as a sort of cautionary side note, when you look at the sinking of the Moskva, it's very easy to sort of almost poke fun at the Russian Navy. And elements of it are poorly run and morale is low, as I described earlier. But there are bits that are run really well. And their secretive nuclear submarine program is very well funded and very well run. Those submarines are well run. They're formidable adversaries. So it's cat and mouse, but they know that they can't operate with impunity. Now, if you start looking at sort of gas pipelines, let's say the Nord Stream or the Baltic Connector, these are things that they can target. So you're right, you can't do all of it all of the time, but you're still going to lock your house, right? You can't stop burglars all of the time, but you still lock your house to make it much, much harder for them. And I think that's really what we're getting at here. We're just deterring and detecting as much as we can. And, even additions like the Proteus, the RFA Proteus that we took up from trade only a few months ago and converted very quickly into a specialist undersea surveillance platform. That's huge. That shows real forward thinking. That is us being proactive in this space in a way that, historically we haven't been. We've generally been a bit more reactive. So that's very encouraging. And I think if we can put that vessel to good use, we've just sailed 6 ships and one aircraft to specifically tackle this task on a NATO-wide basis. 2 frigates, a couple of patrol vessels, and a couple of mine hunters. So we are looking at this. It's being taken very, very seriously, and we're being very proactive about it, in my view, and that's encouraging.
Well, that's really, really interesting. Now, let's just come back then to sort of specifically the Ukraine context. What do you think are the likely outcomes if we're sort of thinking now, unfortunately, this war is going to last longer than many of us hoped, thinking into 2023 and possibly beyond? As things stand, as the sort of current trajectory, the development of Russian capability, Ukrainian capability, and some of the things you've described, where do you think we're going to end up, Tom? And are you optimistic or are you more pessimistic? Because it does feel like quite a pessimistic moment in the war generally.
I'm optimistic, providing we keep supplying them with what they need to carry on doing what they're doing. I mean, they are being extraordinarily innovative. As I said before, the crowdfunding thing they put up to source new drones. I mean, that's just brilliant, right? 100 new maritime drones funded online. So they're being very innovative, but there are some really pointy capabilities that they will continue to need to be supplied with, as well as the intelligence infrastructure over the top of all of that. So the Storm Shadows, the Scalp missiles, which is the French equivalent, et cetera, ATACMS from the US. We've got to keep doing that because we've got to keep pushing the Russians back eastwards. If we don't do that, then the protection of the humanitarian corridor and the ability to maintain some sort of freedom of navigation, albeit slightly distorted and bent up against the coast, against Romania and Bulgaria. So it's in place, but it's a bit wonky. But if we don't continue to suppress both Russian maritime activities and their morale, then that will become harder and harder to endure. And then eventually there'll be a mishap, a caliber missile or a mine. And there was a mine strike actually only last month, hit a Liberian flag tanker. That could have just been a free floating one. It might not have been targeted. But mines are a stinker because you don't know where they've come from and you can almost hide them as anything. There's ultimate deniability when it comes to mines. So keeping the Bosphorus clear of mines, keeping the humanitarian corridor in place, if that all happens as it is now, then that's positive. Like I say, I think, and I do still sort of reluctant to say it, but we are in a positive position where that flow of trade is recovering. But if we don't supply Ukraine with the weapons it needs to maintain that standoff distance, then we will lose that foothold, and it will become very quickly less positive and less easy to control.
We're looking long term then, Tom, beyond this conflict. What do you think? Of course, there's been many reflections about what drone warfare means for tank warfare, for instance, and indeed generally open source information on what that means for battle ops, etc. But what do you think this war is pointing us towards in terms of the future of naval warfare?
It's perhaps a little bit too early to tell. I mean, the emergence of drones, some would argue it's not the emergence of drones in the maritime at all. And in fact, if you look at the Iranian fleet, the IRGCN in particular, they've got thousands of fast attack craft, some of which are autonomous and have been for a long while. So yes, uncrewed vessels go back to centuries, the fire ships, etc. So it's not new, but it is being developed in a new way. I suppose what I'm saying is drones. Look, if you're not in that gang, you're not going to be able to play for much longer. But both ways, you have to be able to do it offensively, and you have to be able to defend against them. Watching the Eisenhower go through the Straits of Hormuz the other day, being tracked by Iranian drones, albeit at some distance, is indicative of that. And the next time a merchant vessel goes past and launches 100 of these things at you, what have you got? What have you got to defeat that? And I think everyone's lagging slightly on that front. There's a lot of work going on. There's a lot of developmental work going on in the UK with Navy X and the like, really looking at this problem. My sense at the moment in the sort of game of naval cat and mouse is that the offenders are slightly ahead of the defenders on this one. And we need to make sure that we close that gap as quickly as possible. And I think the Ukraine war has shown that, the maritime component of the Ukraine war. But the rest of it, actually, it's tempting to sort of overthink these things and sort of imagine that this is going to change the shape, that what's happening in the Black Sea is going to change the shape of naval warfare. I don't think it is. We're still talking about choke points, about the importance of defending them, about the importance of intelligence gathering and providing a picture, about whose weapons got the best range, who's got the best track on who. The fundamentals haven't really changed. And if you take that out into deeper water, around the top, let's say in the high north or in the Greenland Ice and UK Gap, nothing has really changed. It is tempting to brain yourself out of needing warships and go, well, it's just or aircraft carriers is the classic one. They're now completely redundant. Well, they're not. I mean, look at what the US Navy's been doing in the last few months in the Eastern Mediterranean and how effective that has been. Again, said with due caution. Aircraft carriers are not redundant. They're vulnerable. Warships are vulnerable, and they always have been. That's the point. That is and that when you're in it, you're vulnerable, but that doesn't mean you're redundant. So there will be lessons to be learned from it. I mean, from the Russian perspective, some of their failures have been extraordinary. Extraordinary. I mean, the Moskva, the way she allowed herself to get hit in that way. I mean, I hope that we don't need to learn any of those lessons because they're already in place. So yeah, there'll be sort of micro lessons and there'll be macro lessons. I think right now the interesting one is the use of autonomy in the maritime and where we are on our ability to do that and also defend against it.
Well, we're reaching the end of our time, Tom. So just a couple more questions from me. I know listeners will not forgive me if I don't ask you for a little bit more description, some colour of your time as a frigate commander, because it's just so exceptional to have you on and to talk about someone who's actually done this stuff in real life. Tell me a bit about your time on the Endurance and how you got your OBE, because this is quite an extraordinary story, isn't it, from your career?
It is. It's a strange tale because it ends well, but it's not full of glamour along the way. In fact, it was very nearly a catastrophe. We were the Antarctic patrol vessel sent there by the FCDO, ostensibly to patrol the Southern Ocean, and our part of Antarctica, or our slice of the cheese wedge, if you like. So we would sit off the peninsula and we would inspect bases. We would work for the British Antarctic Survey doing research and science, and we'd work for the UK Hydrographic Office, because a lot of the waters down there remain uncharted, and the cruise industry is booming. So we would survey the seabed and provide that information. And also we had as a sort of perk, one of our helicopters had a BBC camera crew, and so a lot of Frozen Planet was filmed from us, which was pretty cool. Seeing that footage that night when they'd just taken it was fantastic. But we had spent a work period in South Georgia, doing some work and research, survey and scientific research there, and we were off to Chile. And for Christmas and New Year, we were deployed for 18 months. So file that away. Next time you say goodbye to your families, we were sent away for 18 months, and we were off to Valparaiso in northern Chile for Christmas and New Year. We'd gone around Cape Horn that morning, and we were in the Magellan Straits when we did some work on an inlet valve, a 4-foot diameter inlet valve. And unfortunately, the work wasn't done particularly well. In fact, it was done badly, and the valve failed. And it failed in such a manner that it couldn't then be shut. And that was the only thing keeping the water out of the people tank. And it came in at 1,200 tons in half an hour. So our engine space was a 1,200-ton compartment. We filled it to the deckhead in half an hour. So that's half an Olympic swimming pool came in half an hour. And the noise of the water coming in was so loud that the people in there trying to stop it, of course they couldn't, but they were trying to bravely. The noise drowned out the main engines that were still running. It was so violent. I put out a mayday on channel 16, the emergency channel, and no one answered because of where we were. We were in the middle of nowhere. So it was a sort of look around the bridge and go, right, we fight this with what we've got. And we spent the next 36 hours doing just that, not sleeping, trying to control the ingress of water, trying to stop it. So obviously the engine room was lost. We lost power and went beam onto the sea. So we were rolling around all over the place. And we had to manage that. We had to manage the internal watertight integrity of the ship, which was really poor. I mean, we took on in total about 2,500 tons of water. We were sitting very low. We were listing and rolling. We were in a poor state, but we managed through by hook or by crook to control this. We got to anchor eventually, and then the cavalry came 24 hours later to whisk us into Punta Arenas, where we then sorted ourselves out. So yes, it was it was sort of the best and the worst of being at sea. You're very vulnerable all the time. You don't need to be in harm's way. You don't need to be up threat or in contact with the enemy in the Navy. Every time you sail, every time you let go your lines, you're in harm's way, because we can't breathe underwater. And so it's worth remembering that when you start taking global shipping for granted. It's not a friendly environment, and we were unfortunate that we let that unfriendly environment into the ship. But from that moment onwards, the bravery and commitment of the ship's company over the next 36 to 48 hours was exemplary, and they. Between us, we saved the ship from sinking.
Extraordinary. Well, what a story. Thank you, Tom, for that. Anything else from you before we wrap up and do our final thoughts? I know we've covered a lot of different areas, but I'm aware there may have been something that's on your mind that's not on ours.
I've mentioned it a couple of times. I let it slip because I've written it in big letters, but it's everything at the moment in the maritime domain. And in fact, in the defense domain, comes down to resources. We're all moving ships around the ocean. The US Navy has done it in an extraordinary fashion in the last few months. We are now sending one of our destroyers out to help relieve that burden into the Red Sea. And that is going to be a tough gig for HMS Diamond down there. And I wish her all the best. Like I say, we've sent 6 ships off to do this critical underwater infrastructure protection gig. This all has a bill. All of this has a bill. Every time we talk about thickening presence or providing commitment or contributing to a task force, that has a resource bill, and that bill is going up. It's been going up steadily for years, and now that rate of acceleration is increasing. And the thing that bothers me, Francis, is I'm not hearing anything from the Treasury about that bill being met. It's being treated as it has been for so long now as a free gift, and it shouldn't be, because the end result of that is the men and women of the Royal Navy bearing that bill. They take that burden on, and it's not fair on them, because it puts them at unnecessary risk. And if you continue to stretch it, then eventually something breaks. And then, because the irony is, at that point, the bill becomes much higher and unavoidable. So it bothers me right now that no one on either side of the political spectrum is really talking seriously about meeting. There's sticking plasters being handed out, and there's promises of an increase to 2.5%, but none of it is real, and it needs to be, because the bill is real and increasing.
Well, thank you, Tom. And of course, that's a relevant question in the military spheres across Europe at the moment, with inflation rising, etc. This conversation about what is the actual increase in spending in real terms, as opposed to merely on the balance sheet, as it were. But Tom, thank you so much. We'll have to have you back. It was just really, really interesting. And I know many listeners will be writing in for their reflections. And I know we have many naval folk who listen to us. So thank you on their behalf too. Final thoughts then. I'll just start off. I mentioned this yesterday, so forgive me if you heard this in yesterday's episode, but I did just want to flag again that you have the opportunity to potentially talk to Dom or myself on this Sunday for charity. It's the Telegraph's Christmas Charity Appeal phone-in day. So it'll be Sunday the 3rd of December, 10 a.m. to 6 a.m. London time. That's 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. EST. The number I've now had confirmed is, so in the UK, 0800 117 118. And if you're an international caller, it is the same number, but you just put the UK country code beforehand. But of course, standard rates will apply. And I'll just say that number again. It's 0800 117 118. I'm afraid you're not able to request who you speak to. You might speak to the editor. You might speak to one of our columnists or one of my colleagues on the comment desk, or you might get me and Dom. It's sort of luck of the draw, really. But it would be lovely to speak to some of you if you're able to make the time to give us a call. And we're supporting 4 charities this year: Race Against Dementia, the RAF Benevolent Fund, Mary Curie Hospice, and Go Beyond, which supports young people. And that's for the whole paper. It's not just for Ukraine, the latest, obviously. So thank you for that. And just one other thing I wanted to flag. Our most requested guest is undoubtedly, I've lost count the number of emails that have come into the inbox, historian Timothy Snyder. And I'm delighted to say that we have interviewed him now. It was Joe, David and myself, and that interview will be going out in Sunday, or so maybe Saturday, maybe Sunday. We will see. Paul Giles has got to edit it, I think, so it will depend on when he's able to do that. But it will be going out over the weekend, and it's a really, really interesting interview. I hope it lives up to the expectations that people have laid on it, because I know he's extremely requested, and we get into lots of different areas about the culture in Ukraine, the historical moment, and also some subjects we've never covered before. So I highly recommend checking that out. But it just goes for me now to ask Tom. You're our guest today. You've got the very final thoughts. What would you like to add?
I just want to remind everybody, if I can do that without sounding like a maritime bore, that this stuff isn't out of sight, out of mind. It's every single land campaign has a maritime element to it. Sometimes it's strategically and totemically important. But the business of supplying what the UK needs every day of the year is provided by the merchant navy and sailors out there battling the sort of conditions I described in my endurance story. And if I could just mention one thing, it's just please don't take that for granted. Keep that in the back of your mind. It happens every day of every year.
Earlier this week, David sat down with Anastasiia, Marushevska and Julia Petryk, co-founders of the Ukrainian NGO PR Army, which works closely with journalists worldwide to share the truth about the war and connect them with Ukrainian speakers, experts and eyewitnesses. They discuss the work being done to raise awareness of war crimes perpetrated by Russian forces. This is their conversation.
Anastasiia and Julia, thank you so much for your time today. Can we start, before we get into the subjects here, would you just introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Yeah, thanks for having us. My name is Julia Petryk. I came here from Ukraine and I'm still based in Ukraine. Before the full-scale invasion, I was the head of PR in a software development company. But on that morning when Russia invaded Ukraine from multiple directions, my life has changed enormously. And now I can introduce myself as one of the co-founders of the Ukrainian PR army who is resisting Russia in the information battlefield.
And my name is Anastasiia Marushevska. I'm also a co-founder at the Ukrainian PR Army, and also I'm the founder and strategic lead of the project Where Are People, that is focused on the deportation of Ukrainians. Also, I am editor-in-chief at Ukrainian nonprofit media Ukrainer International, which focuses on spreading Ukrainian context in over 10 languages. Yes, so also I used to work in communications, both in business and partially in government. And since the beginning of the full-scale war, I'm 100% committed to the information resilience and resistance.
Well, let's start by talking about your work on the deportation of Ukrainian children to the occupied territories and to Russia. I read through the notes you very kindly sent over before you came in, and there were three words that stood out: indoctrination, militarization, and re-education. So Anastasiia, could you talk us through those three terms? And it'd be, I think, very important to understand what they mean on the ground. What does this mean that the children taken are actually going through?
Yeah, so within the Where Are People project, we talk about not only deportation of children, but also of adults. However, with children, there is these specifics that you can brainwash children, you can change their identities. And this is what Russians are doing. It's generally called re-education, which means that children are taken to specific camps where they're exposed to Russian propaganda, where they're taught to be Russians, basically. Where they're, as for example, First Lady also mentioned that Ukrainian children are told that there is no Ukraine and Ukrainians do not exist. There are only Russians. And it's a very confusing idea in the heads of young people. But also there is a militarization part, which we've been doing extensive research into the youth army, one of the organizations that is sponsored by Kremlin, and they basically preparing children for war. And many of the deported Ukrainian children are forced to join the youth army. And of course, there is some horrible indoctrination programs that are involved there, yeah, and you can see these, and they're not hiding it. You can see many information, open source videos where they film all these trainings, where they film children and children sharing kind of their thoughts on whatever's happening. And besides the children that have been deported since the beginning of full-scale war, there are many of them from the occupied Crimea and from Donetsk region as well. And many of those children were very little when Russia invaded the east of Ukraine and Crimea. So some of them not really sure, I guess, who they are. And this is a very dangerous precedent because even if at some point we'll be able to find and locate those children, which is now not the case, we don't know where all of the deported children are. But when we do locate them, we will need to have a great reintegration system for them because they are completely brainwashed. And some of them who are a little bit older, they can resist it. The younger ones can be easily manipulated, to Russian propaganda.
I think it's astonishing what you say about how a lot of this is open source, that it's not something being hidden, it's something actually kind of being boasted about.
At first, when the deportations started being public, Russians were very happy about it. They were saying, they were using this as to show their mercy, to show that they're saving children from the war that they started. Yeah, but they were saying that they're evacuating them and all of this. But when they understood that it doesn't work, that Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova received the ICC notice, and Ukrainian side started talking about it more and more, and it started appearing more and more in the media. They understood that there is something wrong with it. So unfortunately now they're deleting a lot of information. So if before a lot of things could be found through open source, now they're deleting it. So for example, children that have been forcibly, illegally adopted or given to foster families, they try to hide this information because they change their identities, change their names. But yeah, there are many things such as you can see at many Russian websites, and as well on the website and YouTube channel of the Youth Army. They're not trying to hide this. This is a part of ideology somehow that they want to show, I believe not just to Russians, but also abroad. Somehow, look, we're so for traditional values, patriotism, or family, or whatever. And I think they're using this. This is their tool somehow. And yeah.
You mentioned the Youth Army. Lots of these children are forced to join, and it's playing a huge part in their indoctrination and militarization. For people in the West particularly don't really have a sense of this. I mean, I've seen this pop up quite a few times in reports about Russia in books. It's quite difficult for us to know really what it is and how it works. What would you say to us to help us understand what this organization does?
I believe if people have an idea of Soviet Union and how the citizens and the children were treated, which what I mean is you need to be a part of some organization. You need to have your red scarf. You need to follow some specific rules that is given by your teachers or by someone else. And you need to dress the same. You need to do the same that everyone else does. You need to be active. There is no fooling around, there is no playing, you're a part of society and you need to be useful to society, all of this. So it's a little bit Orwell kind of thing, this absolutely wrong idea of what freedom is and what the daily life should look like. So Youth Army, when you look at their videos, you see it. For me, it looks like I'm watching Soviet Union somehow. Soviet Union reborn. They use the same colors of these red communism color, and they have the same idea of listening to the Russian anthem millions of times per day, to have these slogans also be useful for your country. And so it's very dystopian somehow. And I guess these images of communism era, this is something that you should you can compare Youth Army to.
You spoke about the sort of the deliberate and invidious changing of people's identities. One thing linked to this is what you describe as the forcible passportization of people taken to Russia. What do you mean by that, and how does it work?
So forcible passportization is focused on adults as well, because with children it really depends. Sometimes they give them to foster families and then just give them different documents. But with adults, the one that live on the occupied territories or the one that been taken to Russia, they're forced to take Russian citizenship, and otherwise they cannot do anything, which means they cannot even go back, because in many cases, because many people have been deported in the first months of the full-scale invasion. And some of them were taken, for example, to the far east of Russia. And these people don't have money, don't have any means to leave and to go back, even if they decide to or find a possibility to. So without Russian passports, they're not allowed to do anything. They cannot use bank cards, they cannot receive any money, they cannot do anything. But of course, this is they also use passportization as a tool to manipulate, because what they're saying to Ukrainians in the occupied territories, for example, that, well, if you took Russian passport and now you want to go back to Ukraine, well, they will put you to prison. They will call you collaborator. So you should not. Yeah, you should go to Russia. You're Russian now. So it's very, it's taking into account the amount of propaganda and also lack of information on the occupied territories and inside Russia. It's this double-sided question. So now they're changing some rules and they're enforcing passportizations even more than before. And many people are doing what they can to get out. So they refuse to get these passports because they can be, for example, then called to fight against Ukraine. So if you're a man, you can be mobilized to Russian army. And of course, this is absolutely terrible. There was just recently a story about this boy who was deported when he was 17, and he came into age, and they wanted to mobilize him to Russian army. And he managed to appeal publicly to Ukraine, so now he is returned. But this is just one case. There are probably thousands or even tens of thousands of cases like this.
Before we talk about a bit more about the resistance to this and how that works and some of the work you've been doing, could we just take a sort of historical step back? Because, of course, this isn't the first time in history in Ukrainian history, modern Ukrainian history, that this has happened. Could you just put this story in a bit broader, deeper historical context for us?
So basically I think our project where people was also built around the idea that the forcible deportations of Ukrainians is not a random cruelty of war. This is a planned policy of Russia, and it's a war crime on a historical scale. And Russia, on different stages of history, both the Russian Empire and Soviet Russia. Why I say Soviet Russia? Because all of the orders to deport different national minorities and people from different regions of then Soviet Union were coming from Kremlin. They were not coming from local authorities. So on different stages of history, Russian authorities were deporting not just Ukrainians. In 1944, they deported en masse Crimean Tatars, and I believe that you see the results of it now, because by deporting almost every representative of the indigenous population of the peninsula, they replaced them with Russians. And throughout decades, of course, the Russian influence in Crimea was stronger than before, and they did not allow Crimean Tatars to return. They started returning only in the end of Soviet Union and when Ukraine gained independence. And after less than 25 years, Crimea was invaded by Russia again. And also Russians deported Ukrainians from the west of Ukraine because of their anti-communist ideas. They deported Polish people. They deported people from the Baltic states, from Estonia, from Lithuania and Latvia. And this is a very important part of the historical memory for the Baltic states. They really treasure this memory and they remind themselves of what they went through. And as well, they deported Chechen people. They used deportation as a policy to remodel societies and to build much bigger influence on it and to be able to occupy it and to control it. Because we know, someone who studying history a little bit knows that since 14th, 15th century, Machiavelli already knew that you cannot occupy territory for too long because people will resist. You either need to kill everyone or you need to find some other means of control. And I believe that mass deportations is one of the main tactics that Russia is using to take over territories, because territories are people. And this what needs to be understood when Ukraine, for example, says about we need to deoccupy all of our territories. We mean people. And we mean to also find people who've been taken from that territories. Because we cannot say that the war will stop till we bring people home. And unfortunately, historically, we know that most of the deported people never return. And even if we look at Second World War, most of the people that have been deported, they never returned. Children that have been deported from Poland to become Aryan, future generation of Aryans, they were never found. And this needs to be understood, that this is a very dangerous precedent that we see now in modern history. And I think it needs to be take into account the historical scale of it, and that Russia is basically using the same tactics, the same ideas, and we can learn from it, and we can find solutions how to prevent this and how not to make it happen again. Just wanted to give one example of what's going on in Mariupol now. We don't know the exact numbers, but there are some estimates that at least 50,000 people from Mariupol were deported. And some estimates say that around 100,000 were killed. And now Russian government are bringing Russians there. Russians are buying apartments in Mariupol.
Buying? Sometimes they just get inside and leave.
Yeah, they get inside and leave, but also there is a whole market of buy apartment near the beach, near the sea. And
the advertising, all of that.
Yeah.
Would you be able to talk more about that? What do these advertisements look like? Where do people find them? Who's moving?
I don't know, like there were a lot of cases from social media when someone advertises and say that someone served in the Russian army, and they see how great the nature is, how even the ruined city looks better. The Ukrainian ruined city looks better than the Russian unruined one, and they are planning to come back with their families, like from Buryat, a lot of Buryat are based there right now. And I saw the recent news that people put their phone numbers on the doors of the apartments saying the owner is still alive. So this is a sign for someone not to enter and not to loot someone's property. So they treat it as it's something that already belongs to them, but it never was and is not right now. So the behavior is just barbaric. It's not the laws of civilized society when there are some rules under which you perform, under which you interact with each other. So this is like brutal medieval invasion when they just destroyed the city, murdered its inhabitants, and just got into the apartments that are left.
Julie, would you talk to us a bit about the sorts of resistance that you see, that you're helping organise, that the work that you're doing? I think Anastasiia sort of laid out what's happening. So maybe we turn the conversation now to what people are trying to do about it, and for everything from raising awareness to campaigns. What would you say?
Yeah, like I can give an example of the PR army coming into existence, and this is what happened, and probably it's one of the most meaningful things I've ever created and was a part of, when we all were awakened by the sounds of explosions and alarm on that horrible morning of the 24th of February. And yeah, like everybody was asking themselves what to do and how to behave, what's the right decision to take. We all have families, parents, kids, someone to take care of, and that was actually the time of those decisions, whether to stay or to leave, what to do, and how we can contribute to the victory of our country, which was brutally invaded. And the Ukrainian comms and PR community got united, and I would say that our fuel was enthusiasm and strong wish to fight that injustice. And this is how we united our efforts and created the Ukrainian PR army. And that was 100% initiative out of the community. So it was not affiliated with any organizations, governments, whatever. And it was purely driven by the desire to to contribute to the victory on the information front, which is as important as the actual battlefield, where the Ukrainian PR army was showing just impressive results, and that exemplary motivation to fight for the freedom of Ukraine and of our people and land. This is how we started, and ever since we haven't put on hold our activity. We've been evolutionized a lot, so now at least PR Army has some structure, streams, processes, because at the very beginning it was chaos. I don't know how we managed to survive.
It was around 700 people in Slack chat, and we were just gathering all of the contacts, and all of these people were communication specialists or marketing specialists. Everyone was bringing their contacts. For example, Julia, who had been intensive experience in the PR, and she had a lot of contacts. So we started by working with international journalists to provide stories, to provide experts, to provide eyewitnesses from the spot. But then it grew, and for example, Where Are People is one of the projects by the PR Army, as well as we have some others, such as Disarm Russia, which is focused more on sanctions, and also Voices of Freedom, which is basically what we do when we provide with Ukrainian experts and when we build lists of Ukrainian experts who can comment in different languages and different topics. Yeah.
Can I ask two things really? One, what does it feel like to be fighting that war, as you said, the war in the information space? And it seems to me that part of it is sort of a war of narratives. That on one hand, there's the Russian narrative of what's happening and what it means, and the presuppositions that we should have when we're approaching what's happening. And on the other hand, what you're saying is, no, none of that's real. You have to listen to us. It's our narrative, which is the right one. When we conceptualize this as a battle of narratives, how do you win that? What do you do?
I wouldn't say that it's easy, and unfortunately we haven't won that war as well so far. But because Russia is very skillful, and they had, I would say that they are more experienced in disseminating propaganda because they've done that for centuries, like Nastya put it in that historic perspective. They use that newspeak when they come with new terms to define a lot of definitions in the way how to put it in a different light for their information consumers. In our case, I would say that we decided not to address and combat every case of Russian propaganda. We decided that what's the best way to fight with a lie if not to give access to truth. And with that platform, Voices of Freedom, we provide access to hundreds of Ukrainian experts and Ukrainian think tanks, Ukrainian eyewitnesses on a number of topics, because we noticed that a lot of discussions were happening, let's say, in Europe without even engaging anybody from Ukraine. How come? Yeah, so we made sure that through that platform, international media could get access to verified speakers from Ukraine. And at the same time, they also can submit an international speaker, so we would do that background check if that person was not previously caught in disseminating Russian propaganda, or if the person was somehow affiliated with Russian governments or Russian businesses, organizations. So unfortunately, the PR Army doesn't have capacity to address every case of fake news or propaganda, but we make sure that Ukrainian voices are vocal throughout international media, and that we provide that very access to Ukrainian experts.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis, and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. we're doing the same for what is unfolding in the Middle East. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow the Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. As the disinformation war ramps up, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear. The executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.